Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Community Policy Speaks, our podcast here at the Community Policy Forum. The Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities in the UK. We attempt this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. So to set a bit of context with regards to today's discussion, the humanitarian consequences of Israel's war on Gaza are horrifying. According to the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor, which is chaired by US Emeritus Law Professor and former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Richard Falk, the civilian death toll in Gaza as of 20th November exceeds 15,000, including almost 7,000 children and over 3,600 women. More than 33,000 Palestinians have been injured, and a staggering 1.7 million have been displaced from their homes. Israel has been roundly accused of perpetrating war crimes in Gaza and of engaging in an ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. The former director of the New York office of the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, who resigned last month over the UN's handling of the war, has labeled the situation in Gaza as, quote, textbook genocide. Today, we would like to explore the impact of the crisis in the Middle East on politics and on the landscape of democratic rights here in the UK. Given that it's Islamophobia Awareness Month, it's particularly important for us to discuss the ways in which recent events have inflamed Islamophobia at home and impacted British Muslim communities through other means. So today, we're joined by three wonderful guests. Firstly, Rebecca Ruth Gould. Rebecca is Distinguished Professor of Comparative Poetics and Global Politics at SOAS. Her creative and critical practice explores the poetics of politics and the politics of poetry. Among various works, she is the author of Erasing Palestine, Free Speech and Palestinian Freedom, which was published earlier this year by Verso. Secondly, we're joined by Dr. Ben Witham. Ben is a lecturer in international relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS. His research explores intersecting inequalities and global insecurities, including Islamophobia, its social functions, and its racialized, gendered, and classed dimensions. Lastly, we're joined by Sharman Rahman. Sharman is a senior policy analyst here at Community Policy Forum. She has a background in frontline politics as well as corporate experience. Her areas of interest include equalities, political participation, and international relations. Thank you all for taking time out to join us today for this incredibly important and timely discussion. So beginning with yourself, Rebecca, could you please tell us a bit about your book and how it fits within the current political context in the Middle East and here in the UK?
Sure. So thank you for inviting me to this podcast. It's great to be here. The book, in terms of placing it chronologically, well, the sort of seed of it was sown in 2012 when I was living in the West Bank in Bethlehem, and then another seed was sown in 2017 when I arrived to the UK and to the University of Bristol. I was teaching there, and the UK had just a few months earlier adopted the what is called the IHRA or the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And I was actually probably the first person, the first academic to whose writings that definition was applied. And there was a student, who didn't like something I'd written while I was living in Palestine, and so this is a kind of I think we've moved to a moment now where some of this stuff is taken for granted, right? But in 2017, it hadn't yet been, and so this idea that you could figure out what was anti-Semitic and what was not in relationship to this definition was a new thing. And I sort of witnessed that being internalized within UK discourse, political discourse at universities. It began to be adopted. By this point, now speaking in 2023, most universities have now adopted this definition, so it's become kind of internalized in our culture, but it hadn't been. And so I was looking at how that adoption of this definition of anti-Semitism was. Many people have probably heard of it, particularly in connection with the Labour Party. But the main thing about it that's new and kind of, I think, worth taking note of is that it out of the 11 examples of anti-Semitism, 7 of those are related to Israel. So it makes criticism of Israel kind of presumptively anti-Semitic, just denying the right of a Jewish state to exist as such is seen as anti-Semitic. That's given as an example of anti-Semitism, and that's new, specific, especially within the UK context. So that I'm just charting that process through which Palestine solidarity became, we could say, criminalized, or if not, in some cases criminalized, in some cases demonized as being anti-Semitic, and how it's relevant so it's a long journey, and it begins long before the current war in Gaza. But I think the particular relevance of it now is that it has been internalized in our political discourse and our political culture, and it has dramatically constrained the space for free speech for Palestinian solidarity activities, because they're often seen as having to comply with this definition, which is not a law, but it's been internalized in all domains of UK and US and so on, political culture. So yeah, I could go on quite a lot, but I think that's the most important thing to kind of note about the definition. Still retains its relevance to the extent that it hasn't been kind of replaced by anything else, or and the constrictions on free speech that it instituted beginning in 2017 have continued to this day.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think that's sort of a really useful prism through which we can frame the rest of the discussion. I wanted to come on to yourself, Ben, and tying into what Rebecca said. Obviously, yourself and Rebecca are both academics, incidentally at the same institution, or SOAS, here in London. Ben, what has the response been to expressions of Palestine solidarity, particularly in academic settings?
Thanks, Kazim. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to the podcast as well. I think that there's been there's a kind of national picture of what the response has been to expressions of Palestinian solidarity here in the UK in higher education context, and then there's a global kind of context too, or a wider Western context at least. So, for example, there have been stories in the news in recent weeks about students at Harvard being denied contracts they've been offered by law firms in response to statements they made in relation to kind of expressing solidarity with Palestine and to recognizing that there is a genocide unfolding in Gaza. We've seen the rescinding of offers for job contracts and so on. So we've got kind of a broader global context. Here in the UK, I would say that it's somewhat varied by institution. So we've seen, I suppose, in recent days, for example, the rector of St Andrews University issued a statement very much in a kind of personal capacity, I think, or they were at pains to underscore the fact it was in a personal capacity, but supporting the right of students to express solidarity with Palestine, and specifically supporting interpretations of events in Gaza at the moment as a genocide. But I think that's probably an outlier among what are, a broader range of universities that are taking a much more, I suppose at best, a much more cautious approach around kind of protecting academic freedom and freedom of expression, and at worst, perhaps seeking to kind of crack down on expressions of solidarity with Palestine. I suppose what, to my mind, as somebody who has spent some time researching Islamophobia, to my mind, what's most kind of interesting and most disturbing about the response of some universities and of the government, certainly, and of kind of I suppose the wider culture around higher education in the UK, is that students who, I see it as particularly Muslim students, and actually at SOAS perhaps specifically Palestinian students who, because at SOAS we have, for reasons of the history of the institution and its focus on the Middle East, but also for the fact that it has a Centre for Palestine Studies, we have a large number of Palestinian students and Palestinian colleagues at SOAS, and I feel that Muslim students in general, and perhaps Palestinian students and colleagues in particular, are facing somewhat of a kind of a preemptive framing of their expressions of solidarity with Palestine as being intrinsically anti-Semitic, and this is bound up with a very well-established kind of Islamophobic trope, which suggests that all Muslims are effectively or intrinsically kind of anti-Semitic. So I think it's a very dangerous and kind of tense and difficult time at a lot of UK universities, SOAS included, where we have had demonstrations in solidarity with Palestine, and those have not been uncontroversial. So I think it's a difficult and kind of dangerous time. And what I suppose I'm most concerned about is that we might see, and in fact, perhaps we are seeing universities following the government's line on expressions of solidarity with Palestine, which, despite the removal of the Home Secretary Suella Braverman, the government's line effectively does remain that all expressions of solidarity with Palestine, all condemnation of a genocide in Gaza amounts to a form of anti-Semitism and to kind of hate marching and all these other terms that we've heard in recent weeks. So a kind of a blanket opposition to solidarity with Palestinians.
Thank you, Ben. I was hoping, Shaman, that you'd be able to build on kind of what Ben said, and looking particularly at sort of, as Ben articulated, the political and particularly the government response. We also have the Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill, which is commonly known as the anti-boycott, the anti-BDS bill, currently making its way through Parliament. What impact do you feel that piece of legislation in particular is having on Palestinian solidarity at home?
I think it's not actually having a direct impact as yet, but it's what it indicates in terms of our freedoms and in terms of the freedoms of our public bodies, is should it come into law. So it's still going through the process at the moment. And when you look at the way that the legislation has been drafted, firstly, it's a very badly drafted piece of legislation. And Community Policy Forum, we've lobbied lawmakers to sort of vote against it because of the dangers that it poses to public bodies in terms of making free decisions ethically when it comes to their financial decisions. But I think it indicates to us a wider direction in terms of where this government is going with regards to advocacy on Palestinian rights, on human rights more broadly. But when we look at the legislation, it allows for exceptions to be made by the Secretary of State. The only country for which exceptions cannot be made is Israel. So they would have to dismantle the original law or change the original law in order to be able to do that. And I think that specifically indicates the trajectory of the government's position when it comes to the Israel-Palestine situation, that it is not going to be a unbiased arbiter in that situation. It is indicating that it is firmly on the side of Israel, and it will protect Israel, which this legislation clearly does. And I think whilst it won't directly impact us as individuals in terms of our capacity to protest what's happening, what it does do is indicate a broader political trajectory on this government. And I think that's very, very dangerous. But also when you look at, I'm from Leicester, so Leicester City is one of the local authorities that did vote to divest. Now, in real and pragmatic terms, it made no difference to our decisions that we made, but just that sort of rhetorical decision that we made garnered great opposition. So we had to, the city council had to fight several court cases in order to be able to go through with that divestment decision. And I think in a city like Leicester, with the fabric of, diversity, massive Muslim minority, if that legislation was then to be deemed unlawful because of this new legislation going through, it sends a message to generally those who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but also Muslims, that actually you are not free to feel sympathy towards the Palestinians or advocate for the Palestinians. And I think it connotates like a feeling of suppression, a suppression of our individual liberties. And that is a great danger for all of us, I think.
Thanks, Shaman. Just coming back to yourself, Rebecca, I just wanted to see if you had anything to add to kind of what Ben and Shaman have said, particularly as your interests lie in freedom of expression vis-a-vis Palestine and other related issues.
Absolutely. Yes, I do think really important points have been made, and I hope we can do whatever possible to stop this BDS bill from going forward. I think another event that needs to be brought into the conversation is the controversy around UKRI, which is the UK's largest funding body. And this has been alluded to in terms of government policy, but it's something that directly affects academic freedom and the ability to conduct research on the Muslim world, including especially Palestine. So there was a big controversy at the beginning of the war on Gaza when the Michelle Donnellan, who is the secretary, she has a long title, Secretary of Science, Innovation and Technology, basically asked the UKRI, so that's UK research that covers both the social sciences and the humanities, to remove 2 panel members who had, just for very, very mild social media activity. I think one had retweeted something showing solidarity with people in Gaza, and then another merely expressing concern over the government's handling of Prevent and Suella Braverman specifically. And so she intervened. It was really not her, portfolio or her job to do that, and asked that these 2 members, academics, be removed from their panels. And perhaps even more disturbingly, the UKRI completely complied with it when they didn't have to. They could have resisted. And that has now stimulated a boycott of these funders. But the union is advising that. So the concrete implications means that the biggest funding organization in the UK for academic research has announced to the world that it's not going to be impartial when dealing with research, related to topics that are critical of government policies, that are engaged with the Muslim world, trying to engage with Palestinian perspectives. So I think that leaves us in a very bad situation, and I hope there's going to be a change in the future. But that has implications for all researchers.
Thank you, Rebecca. Coming back to yourself, Ben, you alluded earlier on to the pro-Palestine marches that we've seen across the country these past number of weeks. What do you make of the political response to that, and also the media portrayal of these particular forms of activism and solidarity?
Yeah, I think, and this connects to what Rebecca was just speaking about, really, and to Sharman, I think, because I think we've been focused perhaps so far on kind of government approaches and government-funded institutions like UKRI, but I think there is a broader attempt to kind of enforce a political consensus on the issue that suggests that basically, support for Palestinians and the calling out of this genocide amounts to, perhaps indirectly at least, amounts to potential anti-Semitism, and that's been, I think, kind of manifest not only in the government's attempts to brand the demonstrations, these enormous demonstrations, which, having been, politically active in the UK myself for a few decades, these are clearly the largest street demonstrations since the opposition to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of people turning out at some of these marches. So there seems to be a kind of concerted attempt which goes beyond government, I would say, because it also incorporates the opposition, the Labour Party, to impose a political consensus that says that this is the right way to think about this issue, that basically Israel has a right to self-defense, and that right to self-defense might extend, in fact, to effectively a right to genocide, that it has a right to take whatever military action it considers necessary in the Palestinian territories, in Gaza in particular, up to and including the genocidal assault that we've seen in kind of recent weeks. I think that the very fact that we're seeing the numbers of people turning out to these marches that we have seen suggests that this is not a consensus that spreads far and wide among people in the UK, among the kind of ordinary citizens of the UK. And in fact, I think it's more of a kind of elite political project to convince us that this is the right way to think about the issue. But it's not been entirely successful, or we wouldn't have seen these kind of huge numbers of people turning out. But that said, I think one kind of interesting aspect, particularly of Keir Starmer, famously or infamously, in an interview early on in the Israeli incursion into Gaza, said that Israel had a right to defend itself, and in response to the question of whether that included the cutting off of power and water and so on, to effectively a war crime of collective punishment against Palestinians, he confirmed that he did think that Israel had that right. And since then, there's been a lot of backpedaling, and the Labour leadership have been gone to lengths to kind of try to distance Starmer and the party from the idea that there is a right to collective punishment, or that there's a right to commit these kinds of war crimes, while at the same time refusing to endorse a ceasefire and or to call for a ceasefire and so on. But I think one thing that's been interesting about and you know, concerning again as a researcher interested in Islamophobia, about the way in which this politics has played out across British society, and in particular in the Labour Party, is that it has perhaps too often been left to, I think in the Labour Party certainly, to Muslim members. So for example, if you look at the list of councillors who have resigned nationally in response to Starmer's, first of all, his seeming authorization of war crimes, and secondly, his refusal to call for a ceasefire, overwhelmingly it was Muslim councillors that were stepping down. And this, you know, you would hope that this shouldn't need to be the case in a party populated by kind of ostensibly left-wing, progressive, you know, politicians at both a local and a national level. But for a long time, and we've obviously seen since the parliamentary vote, we've seen some break from that pattern as some front bench Labour MPs, including people like Jess Phillips, stood down, particularly MPs in areas with large minoritised Muslim communities. But I think it's interesting and concerning that it does seem to have been left to British Muslims very often to stand up for Palestinians, even in political contexts that are allegedly quite progressive, kind of political contexts like the UK Labour Party.
Thank you so much, Ben. And this ties really well onto my next question, which is for Shaman. So I just wanted to ask you, Shaman, what impact has the response of both the Conservative and the Labour parties had on Muslim public opinion in Britain? And the second part of that question would be, how do you think this could factor potentially into next year's general election?
I think it's had a massive impact on the communities, certainly locally in Leicester where I live, but also nationally. We've seen the outcome of the Muslim census survey, which showed quite drastic results for Labour. Actually, it showed a massive decrease in their support. We know that the Muslim communities in the UK, historically, over 70% have always voted for Labour. So Labour has been their sort of political home over the last few decades. But we have seen that gradually sort of change over the last few years, with things that have been happening internally in Labour. Certainly, I've had experience of that with my experience as a Labour councillor formerly, but this kind of pressure in terms of limiting or policing pro-Palestinian activism within Labour has had this sort of a level of discomfort built already for those within Labour, politicians within Labour, members within Labour, but also Labour voters. I think what was most damaging was the comments that Keir Starmer made on that LBC interview. And in the days sort of after that, with the reaction that they got, they tried to backtrack and say it wasn't a direct response to whether Israel is allowed to do that. They made like a sort of an attempt to backtrack from those comments. But what people didn't know is that earlier on the day that he did the LBC interview, he'd been on Radio 4 and he'd essentially said the same thing, but he wasn't challenged for it. So he wasn't challenged on it. It was just kind of moved on straight away. I think that married with the fact that there's been a reluctance to call for a ceasefire in what is so obviously a clear sort of assault on a people without any form of defense, has unfortunately done great damage to Muslim communities and their relationship with Labour. And like I said, I alluded to before, this hasn't happened just because of this issue. There's been a lot of issues within Labour that have contributed to this sort of feeling of being politically homeless for those who have historically voted for Labour previously. And in the next election, I think that's going to be something to watch out for. A lot of it will depend on the timing of the election, I think. I think Labour and the Democrats in America are sort of banking on the election being so far away that people will have eventually forgotten about it by the time that the election comes. And we know that has been alluded to by people within both the Democrats and Labour. So if the election comes around sooner rather than later, I think it will have a more direct impact. But given what we've seen, and given what's the videos, the sort of uncensored footage we've seen of what's happening in real time in Gaza, I'm not sure that Muslim voters will forget that so easily. It is not like the incursions of 2014 or 2021. This has seen violence on a scale that I don't know if we've seen before in this generation. It's pretty shocking, and I don't see people getting over it that quickly. And we say Muslims, but the reality is it's not just Muslims. There's lots of other people who don't identify as Muslims, who simply find it unacceptable that we can't have a moral response to what is frankly completely immoral, and our history teaches us that it is completely wrong. So I think the election this issue will definitely factor into the election. Conservatives probably won't feel it as much, because I don't think their voters have, I don't think they've got a massive Muslim votership. If the facts sort of point to that they won't lose as much. They will lose for other reasons, though, not particularly this issue, but for other reasons they will lose. I think what will happen is there'll be a big sort of attempt at sort of backing independent candidates, but as well as a good sort of source, upsurge in support for the Greens. I think the Greens have backed a ceasefire from the beginning, and that has, whilst the Greens haven't seen a massive historical vote from Muslim communities, I think that has cut through to Muslim communities, certainly in Leicester, where I live. A lot of people are now sort of pushing for backing the party that's made the right call from the beginning. I know the Lib Dems have also backed a ceasefire now, but it's come a little bit later on rather than right at the beginning. So how much that will cut through remains to be seen.
Thank you, Shaman. I also want to explore some positive forms of Palestinian activism and expression that we've seen, not just from Muslims, but from civil society in general. So coming to yourself first, Rebecca, what has the role of poetry and creative forms of expression been in Palestinian activism, sort of historically and also contemporarily?
So I'd love to answer that question. I also just want to make a final note about following on our conversation about free speech. What's been said, I think it's one thing I often see in kind of the history of crackdowns on free speech is that when there's one incident that's widely publicized, there are hundreds that aren't, right? So we need to also give consideration to the chilling effect of these crackdowns on Palestinian solidarity. And I've seen lots of self-censorship, particularly among Palestinians and other Muslims. So I just want to put that on the table. In terms of Palestinian art and activism, so that's one of my passions. I think it's literature and poetry is really crucial. I also want to call out the art, the visual art that's been taking place. It's something I saw while living right next to the wall in Bethlehem, right near the checkpoint. That there's this huge kind of concrete monstrosity. There's just this wall that bisects villages and neighborhoods and prevents daily life from happening. But the Palestinian response to that was to make it beautiful. They put these beautiful works of art. Poetry also is actually on the wall, various quotes from poetry around the world, images of windows on the wall itself. So I think there's always a sense of perhaps even humor, I would say, to some extent, how the oppression is never complete, the sense of resistance that's reflected in the visual art. And I've written about that as well. That was just very inspiring to me to see that in action, and people would kind of add to it on a weekly basis. There would be new artwork would appear as soon as I would go outside. So I think that's worth mentioning. And the other thing, yes, and about poetry. So we're supposed to end on a happy note. I think it's also important, though, to say that alongside the genocide that's taking place in Gaza, there is also a cultural genocide, right? That's related to kind of literature and poetry as well. So it's important to note the very, very high literacy rate of people in Gaza, something like 98%. And so many of those are poets and writers. And I want to mention the name of Hiba Abu Nada, who is a poet from Gaza who was killed in October 20th. Her work has been, she wrote a novel and then poetry in Arabic. It's recently been translated. I would really encourage listeners to look up her work. You can find it on the magazine Protean. And then there's another poet, Mossab Abu Toha, who was just a couple of days ago arrested in Gaza. He was actually advised by the U.S. State Department to exit at the Rafah crossing, and he was arrested by Israeli forces while he was following the U.S. government's advice. He was released apparently after being beaten, and many people were, others who were arrested at the same time were not. But those are just two very important poets whose name I want to make people aware of. I think they provide incredible insight onto, the actual human costs of the suffering. And not just that, but it's not just, I think poetry in the context of Palestinian solidarity is really crucial because it shows what resistance looks like. And that's, it's not, Palestinians aren't just these sort of voiceless victims who are silenced forever, that they have a lot of to say about what's happening to them. I think one of the best ways of kind of doing honor to this poetry is just by experiencing and reading it. So I actually thought I would maybe read the last, it's a very short stanza from Hiba Abu Nada's poem that she wrote just a few days before she was murdered in an Israeli airstrike. So this is, let me get the title. The translator is Huda Fakhreddin, who is a Palestinian professor of Arabic literature at University of Pennsylvania. The poem is called I Grant You Refuge. It's published in Protean magazine. So I'm just reading the last stanza. You'll see a reference to phosphorus, the white phosphorus bombs that Israel is dropping on Gaza in violation of human rights law. So it's the fifth stanza. I grant you refuge from hurt and suffering with words of sacred scripture. I shield the oranges from the sting of phosphorus and the shades of cloud from the smog. I grant you refuge in knowing that the dust will clear, and they who fell in love and died together will one day laugh.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Very emotional to hear that, particularly from someone that was, murdered in the current onslaught in Gaza. Thank you so much for bringing that in. I can't say that we've ever had words of poetry recited on our podcast, and that was a first, and it's a beautiful way of integrating that into this discussion. Coming to yourself, Ben, you mentioned the scale of the pro-Palestinian marches that we've seen on the streets of London and in other cities in the UK, not just in the UK, but in other world cities as well, not just from Muslims, not just from Palestinians, but from all, members of various religions and creeds and races and nationalities. Are there any other particular forms of Palestinian activism that you'd like to draw listeners' attention to?
Yeah, I mean, there are two things that I would really like to mention. I mean, as you say, kind of our comments previously have been maybe focused on how this genocide has been enabled, and I've kind of talked about the enforcement of a sort of broad political consensus, or the attempt to enforce a broad political consensus, but I don't think it's working, and I don't think those enormous marches in London are the only kind of evidence that it's failing, this attempt to enforce a kind of consensus. And two examples I would kind of like to mention that I guess because I've personally been involved in them, but also because I think they show us something really interesting about the diffusion of resistance to that political consensus, and they show us something about the awareness, the widespread awareness in the UK at least, of the fact that this is a genocide that's unfolding and that it needs to be resisted at all costs. And those would be, first of all, so I live down in Brighton. Sharman was talking about the Green Party earlier being kind of the only major political party to have explicitly called for a ceasefire and to have declared this a genocide. And this is the only Green constituency in the UK at the moment. Who knows for how much longer, because our long-serving MP is stepping down at the next general election. But Brighton is, I used to live in Leicester like Sharman, so I moved to Brighton directly from living for several years and working for many years in Leicester at a university up there. And one of the kind of, I suppose, stark contrasts on arriving in Brighton from Leicester is that it's a very white city. So it doesn't have an enormous Muslim community. It doesn't have a big Muslim constituency. It doesn't really have a big constituency of people of colour, compared at least to Leicester, where you have more than 50% of the city are people of colour. So it was quite a stark change, but as a consequence of that, it's maybe particularly heartening to have seen at a demonstration. So we've had a series of demonstrations, small demonstrations each Sunday on Hove Lawns in Brighton. But a couple of weeks ago, following a series of similar events, initially triggered by an event organised in New York City, we've had a station sit-in occupation at the train station. So we have a mainline railway station here in Brighton. It's the terminus of that train line down from London. And essentially at 5 p.m. one day, in the middle of the evening rush hour on a weekday, several hundred people gathered in Brighton Station, and at the appointed time sat down and produced signs, banners, Palestinian flags. And this was, I said earlier that within the Labour Party, we'd seen it really left to Muslim councillors to take a moral stand very often. But actually, in this demonstration, you were seeing overwhelmingly, likely non-Muslim white people who were showing up, including a very large constituency of Jewish protesters who were showing up holding a banner, Jews Against Genocide banner. So we are seeing kind of a diffusion of resistance and a diffusion of expressions of solidarity with Palestinians and an opposition to genocide around the country, including in kind of smaller rural locations and small towns and cities kind of around the country. So that was really heartening. And I think that there's a creativity, to just touch on what Rebecca kind of connected this up to art and poetry. Some of the creative expression that you see in protest, and I think you see this in probably most protest movements, but is again kind of heartening and positive. So, for example, at that demonstration in Brighton Station, the sit-in demonstration at Brighton Station, there were banners and placards bearing the picture of a slice of watermelon, which you're probably aware, but the watermelon has become a kind of cipher for support for Palestine, because we have kind of, I suppose, the big social media platforms, which are predominantly kind of owned and operated, in the case of Twitter, by Elon Musk, by a very, very, very right-wing kind of character and culture warrior character, if you like. But even more broadly across social media, we see attempts to suppress forms of expression of solidarity with Palestine. And so, as a kind of cipher for using the Palestinian flag, this watermelon emoji had become a kind of a key symbol we were seeing everywhere. And now that kind of what was an emoji has translated into kind of artworks that you're seeing at demonstrations. So I think there's some really interesting kind of creative forms of expression in solidarity with Palestinians at the moment, as people try to find ways around the kind of blockages that are trying to prevent people from making those expressions of solidarity. And the other, very briefly, the other kind of event that I've been involved with this week actually was at SOAS, where we held a staff-student solidarity forum. So it was essentially a meeting organised jointly between the trades unions, UCU and Unison, that represent academic staff and support and professional services staff at SOAS, and the Student Palestine Society of the Students' Union, and the Palestinian Youth Movement. So together we organised a meeting which was so well attended. In the end, we had to create a separate spillover room to allow people, to enable enough people to attend. And at those meetings, we heard from our Palestinian students and our Palestinian alumni about how this conflict kind of affects them directly, but also about how they have felt that their freedom of expression has been curtailed at the university and in the broader kind of political context in the UK. And this is, you may have seen, there was a story, there was some news coverage a few weeks back around the suspension of some students from SOAS in relation to a demonstration that was held at the university very early on. So I think on about maybe the 12th of October, very early on into this period of Israeli aggression in Gaza, there was a demonstration at SOAS, and subsequent to that, some students were suspended. I understand that there's an ongoing kind of investigation into that, but this was one of the, I suppose, one of the topics that brought us together as staff and students who were concerned with a right to freedom of expression in relation to the conflict in Gaza.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you particularly for sharing some of your personal experience. I think that always adds a lovely touch to these sorts of discussions. Shaman, just sort of finally a question for yourself. What has the role of young Muslims been in this new wave of Palestinian advocacy, especially in relation to those utilizing social media?
I think what we've seen is this massive wave of support for the Palestinian cause, not just from young Muslims, but young people more broadly. We talk about the TikTok generation. They're more unapologetic in their sort of advocacy of the Palestinian issue. And what's happening is that young people they're not likely to pick up the FT as the source of their information for this issue. They are getting it directly from young journalists in Gaza. So they're following people like for example, Mutaz Azeza, who's one of the sort of young journalists who's been sort of getting a lot of traction on social media. They don't need it to be filtered by a Guardian article that's sort of, presenting both sides, etc. They are getting their information directly from the ground, from young people who are actually young Palestinians who are quite, bravely narrating what's happening on the ground in Gaza. So they don't, young people have been unapologetic. They've been very, very active in their support for the Palestinian cause. But partly that is because of social media. For all its sins, we do know that there are some benefits of having social media in this respect, because you get information from people from the ground. You don't have to wait for commentary from the BBC or Sky News. You don't have that sort of filter. You get it raw and unfiltered. So that's been a massive sort of contributory factor in terms of educating young people, but also young people are learning about issues in our history. They've got that more sort of fresh in their memories, if you like. So we learn about apartheid, right, when we're at school. And I know my kids are certainly learning about apartheid they're at school age as well. And the lessons of those historical issues are not easily forgotten by young people because it's so fresh in their mind, the learnings. And when we talk about, when I speak to my children about the BDS bill, I bore them to death with some of the stuff that I work on, but they know that when it came to South African apartheid, the boycott movement was a massive movement and a massive contributory factor in the eventual sort of freedom of South Africa. So, and they don't understand the inconsistency here. Why is one boycott movement that sort of led to a huge wrong being corrected suddenly being criminalized in the United Kingdom? And certainly the BDS bill doesn't criminalize an individual from participating in boycott, but when we look at the way this government is going, it's not a far away sort of assertion to make that eventually they will try and make boycotting more difficult for individuals as well. So young people have been a massive factor, and one of the things that we've seen from social media companies is this inability to sort of suppress that sort of activism, and they've tried. We've seen a lot of sort of active accounts have had like warning filters attached to them, or they're spreading disinformation, etc. And we saw a famous quote from we know that TikTok were recently sort of approached in terms of not being successful in terms of toning down hate speech. And obviously pro-Palestinian activism is now being synonymized with hate speech or hatred towards Jews. And the response from TikTok was, it's not TikTok's algorithm that's the problem. It's just that young people are inherently more Palestinian, more pro-Palestinian, should I say. So they are inherently, regardless of social media, they identify more with that cause because of the fact that I want to say, this is my interpretation, but their moral sort of clarity is more intact than, say, politicians who are who have had decades of cynicism sort of erode away their sort of moral clarity when it comes to this situation. Young people don't have that. And, you know, it's something that fills me with hope, if I'm honest with you, in a situation where you see so much devastation and so much suffering, especially because I've just recently, as you know, I've given birth. I gave birth on the 8th of October. So the first day that Israel started this bombardment in Gaza, and learning that there are mothers in Gaza who are having to do C-sections without access to anesthetic. There are women that are having to sort of get rid of, having to have their uteruses removed because of the lack of access to medical care. So they will never be able to have children again. And then the impact to seeing young children, the NICU babies in the incubators, in all of that devastation, seeing the moral clarity from young people and young generations has been a massive sort of reason for hope, despite the devastation. And I hope that, I fear that the government will try and clamp down on this using methods such as prevent, as they have historically done in the aftermath of the Iraq war. There is a fear of that sort of being ramped up. We've seen this speech from, sort of very damaging speech from the former Home Secretary in terms of allying anything to do with pro-Palestinian advocacy into hate, as you know, democratically just attending a march is labeled a hate march. So I fear for the impact that it's going to have in terms of government policy to try and suppress that. But I think we can't move away from the fact that there is hope, and it is certainly something that we need to sort of encourage and champion and celebrate, despite the devastation that's been going on in Gaza.
Thank you so much to all of our guests for giving up your time. I know, given everything that's going on, it is extremely busy. It's also Islamophobia Awareness Month. So here at Community Policy Forum, we've had our hands full, to say the least. So thanking Rebecca, Ben, and Shaman for your time and for your wonderful insights into this timely issue. Please do follow the work of all of those that have joined us. Please do have a look at Rebecca's book, particularly Erasing Palestine. It's extremely relevant given the current context of what is going on in the world. And please do keep up with the Community Policy Forum on Twitter, on Instagram, and on wherever you get your podcasts. Please do share this podcast episode with anyone that may be interested far and wide. Thank you so much.